So welcome to CAPS in NYC, the story thus far. The last workshop I was in, it was talked about a lot, so you may have been in the New York 1515, so I'm sure you're all just really excited to get started. So I'm Kristin Edwards. I am currently a consultant working with the New York City CAPS Steering Committee. CAPS stands for Coordinated Assessment and Placement System. That is basically what we're calling in New York City the Coordinated Entry System. So the CAPS Steering Committee was formed about 2 years ago. And it's made up of key representatives from government, providers, and policy and advocacy organizations. You'll hear a little bit more about the CAPS Steering Committee from both Craig and Jeanette, who are panelists. This workshop will be an opportunity to hear a little bit more about coordinated entry, both on a federal level, as well as how we are beginning to implement it here in New York City. Coordinated entry, in a nutshell, I won't steal Norm's fire, but in a nutshell, is just a central or coordinated system that we're now required by HUD to implement. It ensures that housing and other resources are fair, easy, and efficient to access, prioritizing the most in need of assistance. And before I introduce the panelists, I just wanted to give you a breakdown of our time here this afternoon. So first, we're going to hear from each panelist. We'll hold the questions until we hear from each of the panelists. And at that point, I may have a few questions, and then we'll open it up to the larger group. So hopefully we'll have the last like 20, 25 minutes for question and answers. So let me introduce the panelists. So first we have here Norm Suchar. He is the director of HUD's Office of Special Needs Assistance Programs, SNAPS for short. They operate the Continuum of Care and Emergency Solutions Grants programs. And also prior to his work at HUD, he worked at the National Alliance to End Homelessness. After we hear from Norm, and Norm will give us, obviously, the federal perspective on coordinated entry, and then we will hear from Craig Retchless. Craig is an Assistant Deputy Commissioner at New York City Human Resources Administration, HRA. He heads up the Office of Clinical and Service Systems Integration, overseeing disability services program, supportive housing services, and clinical policy and procedure for the customized Assistance Services Department. Sounds very complicated.
It's very
and
important.
Lots of acronyms, of course. And prior to his work at HRA, Craig worked for the state OMH and several nonprofit providers of mental health services. So we'll hear from Craig around what HRA is doing to start implementing CAPS. We'll hear a little bit about a pilot he'll show us. And then we're going to hear from Jeanette Ruffins. Jeanette is the Senior VP of Housing, Resources, and Development at Bailey House. Ms. Ruffins oversees all housing services, which includes over 400 units of congregate and scattered site housing, and housing placement for homeless persons with several subpopulations, including LGBT young adults, post-incarcerated adults, and adults living with mental illness, addiction, and other chronic illnesses. She's a passionate housing advocate and is serving her second term as co-chair of the New York City Continuum of Care. And so Jeanette will give more of kind of a provider perspective on CAPS. Jeanette has also been a key part of the CAPS Steering Committee. So, Norm, you want to take it away?
Yep.
All right, thank you very much. As Kristin mentioned, I'm Norm Suchar from the Department of Housing and Urban Development. I work at the SNAPS office. Everyone's familiar with SNAPS, right? Everyone knows what we do? Good. We'll just sort of jump right into things. So I want to just get a sense of where you all are with coordinated entry and how you're approaching this. Can I just ask quickly, how many of you are providers of homelessness assistance of some sort? Raise your hand nice and high. Okay, how many of you provide emergency shelter? Okay, and permanent supportive housing? I assume there are many of you here. Rapid rehousing? Okay, prevention assistance? Just out of curiosity. Okay. How many of you, in some way, shape, or form, fund homelessness assistance, either because you're with a city or state government or foundation or, I don't know, something else? You just have a lot of money that you're giving away? Do we have any consumers of homeless assistance in the room? Anybody? Okay. And how many of you do research, evaluation, that kind of stuff on homelessness assistance? Great. So good, pretty good mix of people in the room. So I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of coordinated entry, some of the key features of coordinated entry, and talk about some specific topics that I think are often either points of contention or points of confusion when people are developing coordinated entry. So the concept of coordinated entry really sprung out of things we've been learning about how you end homelessness in a community. So I think I just want to make that point because often there are conflicts, disagreements about how to implement coordinated entry, and I think it's always important to recognize the connection back to the purpose of this whole endeavor is to end homelessness. Coordinated entry does that in a lot of ways. It makes your assistance more efficient. It reduces the time from, you know, say someone's first becoming homeless to the time they get a referral to assistance. It reduces waiting lists. It does this through a lot of different mechanisms. But the point of the exercise at the end of the day is to help a community better end homelessness. So I just always want to, I always like to start there and to bring the conversation back to that. There are sort of several major goals. As we at HUD were developing guidance around and rules around coordinated entry, we had several very specific goals in mind. One was, it's really important that coordinated entry, coordinated access makes it easier for people to access assistance. One of the things that happens when you have a scarce resource, and homeless assistance is a scarce resource, particularly permanent supportive housing. Way more people need it than we have units of it available. And what typically happens when you have a situation like that is a lot of barriers spring up to sort of make it harder for people to access. It's hard to deal with people, an endless stream of people coming asking for assistance when we don't have enough assistance, and so you end up with a series of barriers to accessing assistance. And the consequence of that is that often the people who need assistance the most, the ones who don't know how to navigate systems well, are the ones who are most likely to be left out. So coordinated access is supposed to make it easier for people to access assistance. Again, really important point from our perspective. Coordinated entry is supposed to help prioritize assistance based on need at every level of assistance. So no matter what kind of assistance you're providing, coordinated entry is supposed to help you identify who is the person who needs that assistance most and target that assistance to that individual. I think over the course of the past 3 decades of doing homeless assistance, I think there was this view, which makes sense in a lot of ways, that certain interventions, certain types of assistance are a right fit for people in certain circumstances, right? So you have a short-term assistance, so you need someone who has a short-term problem, right? Or you have a type of assistance that doesn't really provide assistance with, mental health and those kinds of things, so you shouldn't be serving people with mental health disorders and things like that. That, I think, turns out to not be the way homelessness assistance works. People's experiences are very complicated. They have a lot of resources. They exist in an ecosystem of stuff. We get the most value out of our assistance when we're providing it to people who need it the most, regardless of whether you think it's just not enough for them. Often it's just even a small thing that will get somebody over the hump. So when we look at data about the success rates of different programs and different types of assistance for different types of people, mostly there's little correlation, right? Rapid rehousing seems to work fairly similarly for people of many different circumstances. It probably works a little better for you. You probably have slightly higher success rates for people with with fewer barriers. But at the end of the day, your job isn't to maximize your success rate. Your job is to maximize your value added. And so we very much want to focus on the people who have the highest needs, because that's where the biggest opportunity is for value added. So in addition to prioritizing based on need, another purpose of coordinated entry, and this is really important, is to lower barriers to entry for different kinds of projects across the community. We at HUD have obviously had a very, very strong emphasis on this in our NOFAs over the past couple of years. We're going to continue having an emphasis on this and for the entire future of the planet, I hope. So lowering barriers, really, really important priority. At the end of the day, what coordinated entry is trying to do is trying to make homeless assistance decisions about how homeless assistance works in a community, the responsibility of all the stakeholders in the community, not just the particular organization that happens to be funded for a particular activity. So those are the major goals. We're trying to end homelessness, we're trying to make it easy for people to access assistance, prioritize based on need, and lower barriers to projects. So I want to talk a little bit about a few different sort of topics that I think often are confusing or complicated or hard to deal with in a coordinated entry process. So I want to talk a little bit about the importance of connecting your outreach to coordinated entry. This is, again, a lot of people don't access assistance for a lot of reasons. They don't like the way they're treated. They've had bad experiences in the past. They have a mental illness that makes it hard for them to interact with, different kinds of institutions, including the homeless assistance system. It is really important that those individuals are included and assessed and prioritized in the same way as everyone else. And the way that's typically going to happen is through outreach and connecting your outreach to your coordinated entry process. So as you're developing this, what you're thinking about is every kind of assessment that happens at a particular coordinated entry location should also be happening for people when they're engaging with outreach. Now, there are a lot of different ways to do that. Maybe you have the outreach workers do that. Maybe you have different people who come out, an assessor who accompanies an outreach worker. Maybe you can convince people to come in off the streets and to a coordinated entry location. But your guiding principle here is that people who aren't entering our system should be assessed and prioritized in the same way as everybody else. I want to talk a fair amount about waiting lists, because I think waiting lists are probably one of the biggest challenges we face in homeless assistance. And so this is kind of an uncomfortable thing to talk about. It would be much easier to talk about providing homeless assistance and who gets matched with what resource if we had enough for everybody. That would be a very different discussion. But we don't have enough for everybody, but we still have to have this discussion. So one of the things that happens when people first do coordinated entry is that they create sort of this scoring paradigm for different interventions. So let's imagine a tool that has a 0 to 20 scale, and the 15 to 20s get permanent supportive housing, and the 10 to 15s get rapid rehousing, and the 0 to 10s get sort of a light visit with caseworkers to talk about housing interventions or something else. And then what happens is that a lot of people are scoring for 15 to 20. So you have, 20 people a month scoring 15 to 20, but you only have 5 slots of permanent supportive housing opening every month. And so you're just sort of creating this long, long waiting list. That is not the way to do this, right? So what we need to think about is not about sort of matching an intervention with a particular score, but figuring out, given the people we have, given the resources we have, how do we match the resources we have with the people at the appropriate scale? So the way to think about this is, if you have 5 units of permanent supportive housing coming online, available a month through turnover or whatever, you're looking at the 5 people who who score highest on your prioritization process index, whatever, and they're the ones that are being referred to permanent supportive housing. Then if the next thing you have is 10 units a month of rapid rehousing, then the next 10 are scoring that are getting rapid rehousing. So that's the way you want to prioritize. And what that means is that a lot of people are going to get nothing, right? Or, they'll get shelter or some very light intervention, but they'll likely not be getting put on any list, right? But that's the way coordinated entry is supposed to work. One of the things that really drives long lengths of stay in homelessness and bottlenecks in the homelessness system is people who are sort of waiting for their name to come up on the list when it's, in reality going to be, 18 months, 2 years, right? That is just not a productive and healthy way to run a homelessness system. So those waiting list discussions are really, really hard to have, but they're really, really important. I want to talk a little bit about assessment tools. This assessment tool, how many of you use in your community the VI SPDAT, for example? How many of you use something else? Okay. So there's no right answer to this question. That wasn't a test by any stretch. There's no real right answer to this question. There isn't a lot of science yet to how you predict stuff. Determining who's most vulnerable, who most needs assistance is not, we don't know the equation to do this. If we did, we would publish it and tell everybody, and then everybody would be using the same tool. But we don't actually know, and in fact, what a lot of research is telling us is that it's probably an impossible endeavor. You can probably sort of assess to some degree, but really the level of fine-tuning and specificity we want out of this is probably never going to happen. So I think we have to think about the assessment tools are only going to get us so far in this endeavor. The process of prioritization is really, really important, and I'm not discouraging you from using assessment tools. It is really, really important that you use an assessment process of some sort. But the value of specific questions and a specific sort of combination of assessment scoring criteria and things is not as important to focus on. It is not going to get you super far. So I just wanted to sort of, I think it takes the pressure on getting the particular questions in the assessment tool exactly right, and increases the pressure on making sure you use an assessment tool. I want to talk just a minute about the concept of phasing assessments. So one of the traps that I think I've seen in communities is that when you have an assessment, particularly when you have a lot of researchers around the table working on the assessment tool, there is a great desire to want to collect as much information as possible and to learn as much as possible and to try to foresee every conceivable use of any kind of information and to try to collect as much as you can. I think that's, you probably want to resist that as much as you can. You want to think about assessment as a process, not an event. And you want to think about assessment as what is the stuff we absolutely need to know now to do what we need to do right now. And then if we need information later, we can always collect information later. So let me sort of walk through how this looks. One of the first things people tend to try to do in a coordinated entry process is assess whether somebody needs diversion. Or whether there's a possibility to divert someone from shelter so they don't need shelter, and there's another safe place for them to stay. So there's probably 4 or 5 questions you ask, mostly to start a discussion. Do you need to know somebody's history of experiencing violence? Do you need to know somebody's employment history? Probably not. Might you need it later on? Certainly, but there's probably going to be, there will be a time later on when you can ask that series of questions. So thinking about staging your assessment process so that you're just asking the questions you need to know at the time you need to know them is really helpful. I think there's sort of there's also a lot that a provider will want to know about an individual as part of the process of providing services and providing assistance. There is no need to collect all that information at the coordinated entry process. Provider doing their own assessment is an important part of the building relationship with a consumer, and it's entirely appropriate to have different providers doing their own assessments once a person has been enrolled in their program. And then I also want to talk quickly about veterans and how you interface with the veteran system. We get a lot of questions about this. And I think we probably haven't been as clear as we should have about how you work together with your VA on this stuff. One of the things that I've heard from some communities is that they're looking for a single assessment tool that they use for both veterans and non-veterans. So that might be a good thing. It is not necessary as part of this process. It is okay to have like VA referring people to your, COC-funded projects, provided that that's the way you've designed your process and the COC and the VA are working together, and you've designed your protocols that way. That's okay, right? We don't need to be creating extra steps for people just because, they come in through the VA bucket instead of the COC bucket. There's a lot more flexibility than I think people realize about different ways to work with VA. The keys are you need to be consulting each other, the COC and the and VA, and write down what your process is so it's clear and transparent and everybody understands what it is. If you can use similar assessment tools, that's certainly fine. And we also want to make sure that veterans can come in through any door in this process. If they come in through VA, that's fine. If they're coming in, for example, through a singles coordinated access point, that's fine as well. The last thing I want to talk about is the need for constantly reevaluating this process. One thing we've learned at looking at coordinated access processes, coordinated entry processes around the country, is that they change how the system works, and that's kind of the point. But because they change how the system works, they also need to continue to evolve. So it's always important to be looking at how are these assessment questions working? How are these assessment processes working? Are we creating bottlenecks in the system? Are we not underutilizing resources in the system? What is this telling us about how much of different kinds of assistance we need? So it is really important to have a constant reevaluation process that looks at consumer feedback about how well things are working. Are these questions valuable to the consumers? Do they understand what you're trying to get at? Are you getting the kind of information you want from them? Looking at data about are the people being referred to projects actually receiving assistance from those projects, or are people sort of dropping out in different places? Are we underutilizing certain things? Are we overutilizing certain things? And do we have bottlenecks and waiting lists that we've created in the system? These are all important. And of course, how is the referral process working for providers in the community? So all very important things. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Craig.
Hi, everyone. So thank you, Norm. That was a wonderful setup for coordinated entry, and I'm going to try to connect what I'm about to show a little bit with some of the points that you were making. We, in New York City, went through a lengthy process of developing what we call the Coordinated Assessment Survey. This is the entry into our CAP system. And so what I'd like to do is give a little context on, how that process started. So everyone knows that this is a HUD mandate, and that for our COC funding, we need to develop the coordinated entry system. The challenge for New York City is that, and this is maybe a good problem to have, is that we have so many resources in New York City that are dedicated to kind of specific populations and ways to develop, housing. And so I think there are about 52 funding sources, maybe even more, that can be a part of any project that serves like a supportive housing project. And so the CAP steering committee felt that it would be a good use of at least an entry point into the CAP system to have an assessment of a person's eligibility for different housing programs in order to for them to achieve permanent housing. So what we did was we worked, at HRA to develop this coordinated assessment survey system, which asks a series of questions, and what it does is it gives a potential eligibility for not only all the different categories of supportive housing, but also some of the rental assistance programs that are available to homeless households. And so we were, the thought is that, if you're a homeless household in the shelter, you've already had an assessment. You've already had a clinical assessment, right? And, but maybe you haven't really fleshed out everything that you're like the shelter worker, maybe you haven't fleshed out everything that person may be potentially eligible for. And that's what we were hoping to solve that issue, for the clients who find themselves in that situation. We feel that it's a good system also because what we find is that you may have somebody who's working with you on resolving your homelessness, but not everyone has the same level of knowledge of all these assistance programs and supportive housing options, who's working with the individual or the family. And so this is a way that kind of levels the playing field for the client to have some kind of system to give results on what the client may be potentially eligible for. So I'm going to go through, I'm going to demonstrate the system, and hopefully it kind of connects the dots with what Norm was saying. All right. Crossing my fingers, everything works. Okay. So we're in a training environment, so this is all like a case that has been set up. This is not client identifying information. But if you had access to the coordinated assessment survey, which we have expanded to all of the shelter programs, DYCD, some DV programs, we've already, expanded greatly to all of the programs that have been using the 2010E or the PAC system. So I will just let everyone know that there is also a survey guide that we developed, and if you wanted to know more about the supportive housing that you're found potentially eligible for, or your client is potentially eligible for, there are many guides built into the system. So we enter through here. Okay, so I'm going to start a new survey. I have to do a few things. I'll talk while I'm doing this. So one of the first things that we're going to need to do is get the client's consent, of course. And in order to make this as seamless as possible, and the people who are working directly with individuals will appreciate this, is that we developed a consent form that will be good for not only the coordinated assessment survey, but also for the supportive housing application as well. So you won't have to go back to the client to get a new consent. So I'm going to say I have the consent, when the consent was obtained. Everything that has like a red asterisk is a required field. All right, so. All right. So you can match on Social Security number or Medicaid, so that's why the Social Security number is not required. All right, so then I hit the search button, and what the system does is it goes into the HRA database, and it attempts to match the client to several things, and I'm going to highlight them. One of the first things it matches it to is the client identifying documents that may be in the HRA repository. And everyone knows that when you go to place somebody in supportive housing, you're going to need additional documentation besides, an approval of the 2010E. There are requirements for, photo ID, Social Security number, client income information. So what we did was we programmed the system to search for these documents in the HRA databases so that it could return those documents. And so here's the client documents. So for this person, we matched on a Social Security card and a proof of income letter. And so these are hyperlinks to the document. The next section is any prior submitted surveys. So we all know that our clients can be transient, and so they may not always be at the same shelter program even. So this is good because if you had a prior survey done and it's fairly recent, the information may be good on the individual still. And then this is the section where it matches with prior supportive housing application materials. So you can see here, it's giving a lot of good information just in this grid. It's saying that the person had a referral. They were eligible for New York 3 Pop A. See, the New York City 1515 is already in there, which is great. They were approved for SMI housing, and then it gives the level, the type. And for this particular agency, it's not showing the whole thing for some reason. I don't know if I want to mess around with but it continues on, and it shows placement data information as well. So if the client has ever been placed in supportive housing, it will show that information as well. I should qualify, that's New York supportive housing. So this is also a hyperlink to the supportive housing application itself. So whatever was submitted by the referral source will be able to have access to it. Now, I think that this has several advantages if you're working with somebody. First of all, you may not know that they had a prior approval. They may not be sharing some of their clinical information with you as well, in their history. And I think that this is good because you can start to engage them in a conversation around what might be a potential option for them to be referred for supportive housing, if that's what they would like to do. So these are just documents that, so you could see the prior psych eval. Also, the assessments may have content that would be helpful to actually, write the new documents if you need to update the assessments for a new application. Okay. So then, once the consent, so this gives you a lot of information, and then there are several, this is, over here are all the different sections that, to complete the survey. We start with a household. I'm going to make this person a single, and you see how it pre-populates. If it's single, it goes to 0 and 1. If it's a veteran, it says yes, discharge status. So this is important because if the veteran has an other than honorable discharge status, they may not be eligible for SSVF or VASH, which is part of the programs that would, you could potentially have as a result later on. But we'll make this person honorable discharge. And they're connected with VA healthcare services. So every question that we have is tied to some kind of logic that would potentially qualify the person for some kind of housing, rental assistance, or supportive housing. So this is actually a real-time match with a CARES database and the HASA database, so it will give you the homeless time of the individual or the family, or if they're in HASA. And so, as you can see, this person, it shows that they had the 12 continuous months. So for this person, they meet the HUD criteria for chronic homelessness as well. So you'll know that information. And these are the breakdown of the homeless day count. So the system, based on this, will pre-populate. It's looking a little wonky. Sorry about that. The system is usually over here. It's the source. Is your client currently homeless? See, it was pre-populated because the data shows that they are still homeless, that we're getting, the data feeds we're getting from DHS and HASA. So then all of these questions are tied to different eligibility for housing and rental assistance programs. And as you can see, if, say I have some kind of other information, excuse me, I can change these answers, and then it would change to user entry. So say you had a match on a prior supportive housing application, and it had some kind of documentation of homelessness in the packet. That would be valuable information in order to determine their eligibility. So that completes the homeless status information. And then you can see up above we have like a little completion bar for those who are inpatient. You'll see that you're 32% complete. And you can go back to the client documents if there's anything in there that would be needed for completing the survey. So we're going to make this person no for domestic violence. Yes for health information. And here you can see for substance use disorder. It has additional questions. Am I running low? Okay. You have serious mental illness, and this is a link to a layman's version of the SMI eligibility definition based on the New York State Office of Mental Health. All right. We'll keep going. I may rush a little bit. I'm running low. I'm running out of time here. All right. So I want to definitely show this. This person unemployed. So the employment and the income information is for a lot of the federal housing programs. You have to be at a certain level of income, like 60% AMI. So we'll say SSI, SSD. Which is nice. It has a built-in calculator, so those who are not good at math, we've helped you out a little bit there. And then if I said yes to the person being, having anyone else, we have to count all those who are receiving income in the household. So, I think I have to go through and say no to these. Sorry about that. So, see, recognizes that everything was done, and that gives you your household income. All right. It's letting me know that I had an incomplete for the DV and health. So I went back, and I think that's it. And then that made it complete. All right, and what's incomplete on here? All right. These are legal questions that are exclusionary for HUD. You do need to be a U.S. citizen, or for federally funded programs, you do need to be a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, asylee, or refugee. And then we're just going to say no to these. Some of these are very sensitive, so we added an unknown, and you would have to time whether these are, you wanted to ask some of these questions at what point you were engaged with the client. I'm going to say no existing housing approvals. All right, so it says, are you ready to finalize the survey? And so once I finalize it, it then makes the survey permanent. It will then be, it'll be the point in time capture of what you filled out in the survey. And then you get your housing results. So these are all the potentially eligible housing programs, SMI, New York 1 and 2, New York 3, Pop A, 1515, some of the federally funded, and because I checked veteran, they made them eligible for the VASH. And so you can see there's also a what to do, like what are your next steps. So this could be used, and we piloted this with 7 programs intensely. And what we found is that a lot of the clients that were very hard to engage, we were getting feedback from the workers who were part of the pilot that actually this helped because they had something to discuss with the client, and then they engaged in a deeper level with the client around like a housing exit strategy. So we got very good feedback on that. And they liked that it was instructive and it gave you resources. So I'll just show you one last thing, and that is the housing resources page, which, gives more detailed like fact sheets on all of the programs, and gives you a sense of if you wanted to really know what the programs are about and research them. So that's it for the demo. Okay, I'll just log out. Oh, one last thing. So just wanted to share some statistics on this, on the coordinated assessment survey. So far, we started the pilot in October 2016, and this is data up to May 19th, 2017. And as you can see, we have had just over 1,400 surveys completed or received, and completed at a rate of 96%, which is a very high performance rate for completion of survey. Most of the surveys are completed within one day. Some people take some time to gather more information and go back and complete it, but most of the surveys are completed within 30 minutes. So 80%, I think that that's a significant number. 95% of the clients completed, that had surveys completed, were potentially eligible for some housing program. 49% for supportive housing, 63% for HRA and DHS shelter programs. And then 38% of clients surveyed had a prior 2010E application in the past, and of those clients, they had an approval rate of 80%. So of the people who were found eligible, got a result for supportive housing in the housing results portion, 60% of the clients found potentially eligible submitted a 2010E with an approval rate of 84%. So future enhancement, we plan to link the coordinated assessment survey to the 2010E application. We're going to expand verified data sources for homeless income, existing subsidies, veteran service connection, whatever. We're just going to keep working at it. It's an iterative process. We're going to keep working at populating it and making it so that it's drawing data from a verified source. And then we would like to expand the housing programs for potential eligibility. All of that involves logic and development around each program, but we have a good start, and we plan to expand to other housing and rental assistance programs. So now I'm done. Okay, thank you.
So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeanette Ruffins. I'm the Senior Vice President of Housing at Bailey House, and I'm also one of the provider co-chairs, the provider co-chair for the New York City Continuum of Care. I currently, the agency receives has five McKinney-Vento programs, so this was really important to me, and I've been a part of coordinated access for a while. So how many of you are funded through McKinney, receive McKinney funds? Okay. So I didn't do a PowerPoint. When I thought about doing a PowerPoint, I was either going to call it New York, we're very special, or it's complicated, right? And so one of the things about New York is we think we're terminally unique. Like, you know, it's so difficult to do here because we always are so different from the rest of the world. But there are a lot of big cities doing this and doing this very successfully. So it's important for us not to get stuck in our own heads thinking that it can't work here because of the many barriers. And one of the barriers are that the continuum of care, and as much as we we started this process partly because it was mandated by HUD for McKinney programs, is that we are, as Craig said, not the biggest part of this pie. So in doing centralized access or coordinated entry, we actually were trying to coordinate not just for the McKinney-Vento programs, right, but for the entire city that has maybe, I think you said 57 different possible funding sources for how you both come in and can leave the system. So we have lots of back doors in our system. And so that was one of the biggest things, was trying to get everybody in the room, all of the other systems, and OASIS and DHS and DYCD, and trying to talk about how people enter the system now and what it would take to coordinate entry, truly coordinate entry. So we are starting with the exit. So if you think about it as a funnel and all of these buckets that you can come out of the funnel if the funnel moves, right? So you come in this way, you go into this bucket, or this bucket. You know, we're starting with the supportive housing bucket. But like Norm said, one, supportive housing resources are very limited. And two, there's a whole population out there that probably needs support services, but not necessarily long-term supportive housing. And part of the problem is because we don't have a model that actually fits that. You either get into supportive housing because maybe for the next year, or it seems like where you are with your vulnerability right now, you're eligible for supportive housing. The only thing we have is to put you into permanent supportive housing, and then you're there for the rest of your life. And you're there in New York, you're there for the rest of your life because we don't have a lot of options from supportive housing to grade it down again to have affordable housing on the other side, right? So forget the New York City housing market. What is it that we would really want to have? And so we're starting with the access to supportive housing, but eventually we have to get both the rapid rehab, we have to look at how many people can get out with rapid rehousing. Do we have a services light model? How do we kind of support people as they move out for a finite period of time and then step away? How do we financially support people in that process? And that's some of what, you know, we know Advantage and some of the other programs do, but are we really preparing people so that when we walk away from that housing subsidy, they are actually able to hold on to their housing? So there are a lot of pieces, moving pieces of this. When we started talking about coordinated entry in New York, we did a lot of focus groups, right? And we had a lot of people in the room. And we had both providers and we had consumers. And one of the things that they said, so I'll just talk about some of the things that people see as a benefit, which is less creaming, right? Really trying to, as a supportive housing provider, not necessarily picking my people, right? So basically saying, I'm going to go into the coordinated entry. I have housing for people who are HIV positive with mental illness, and the person who's going to come up next on the list, that's my referral, right? And so the funny thing is that showed up as both a positive for people, but it also showed up as a negative because from the case manager's standpoint, now I will specifically talk about my case managers, you know, a really good case manager works the system, right? So they get their person who let's say we have 100 people on the wait list, who might actually be number 42 on the wait list. A really good case manager, Jeanette, calls Kristin, who has a vacancy, and I talk about my client, and I walk my client through the system, and I get number 42 housed before the other 41, right? And so the case managers could recognize that that's not necessarily the most vulnerable person, but they like having that backdoor end around. So they saw that as both a positive and a detriment to the system, that we were going to close some of those back doors and really focus on the most vulnerable. One of the other thing that the providers thought that hopefully with this, both the assessment and then a vulnerability index, we would be doing a better match for who really needs the services in supportive housing. And I think we'll have to do some research over time to see whether or not the people who are coming from, although Norm said it wasn't necessarily about successes, which that's going to be hard for the providers to get to, which is a kind of value add. Like, so are you helping people now, right? Because we have very, very specific, goals that both our funders are looking for. So I don't know how we're going to actually integrate that concept in, because you really are, you're trying to, as we start to take the most vulnerable, and we know that housing them, housing is healthcare, housing is the first step to kind of change, right? We're all supportive housing providers, we all know that. As we focus on the most vulnerable, it is likely, at least initially, our successes may dip. And it has to be something that we're willing to face and to look at maybe how do we have to change the service modality to make that work. I think the other thing about coordinated entry, which came up in Craig's presentation, is that if somebody comes to me and they've already been in 3 systems, very much like with Social Security, it goes back to your first application. So the joy of being able to find out that you're already in the system, that you already have an application, and as you move from provider to provider, even though you may not still be stably housed, you're still on that list and you still have an index and you would still have your place. And instead of feeling like you're starting over every time somebody moves, and we know especially for our most vulnerable people, they move the most. Some of the concerns on the other side were kind of the timeliness of referrals. One of the things also about working with very vulnerable populations is that they do move a lot. So now I've got number 1 on the list. I can't find number 1 on the list. So from the provider's standpoint, the questions are, how long do I have to wait for number 1? When can I interview number 2? Those kinds of things. Real kind of just nitty-gritty stuff. Also, for some of the supportive housing providers, especially the congregate supportive housing providers, there was some concern, which I have a small housing facility, well, small, 46, for people living with HIV and AIDS who are also mentally ill and actively using. And there's a tipping point in my building, I have to say. It's almost like I can handle 7 active schizophrenics not in treatment, and then number 9 makes the whole building feel out of control, right? So it's almost like there's a balance, right? And so I think as we start to really try to house the most vulnerable, one of the things that we heard from a lot of the providers was over the first couple of years of this system, where you really are serving people who are the most vulnerable. What does that mean, especially in congregate settings, where you then are going to have a high concentration of high needs, and do we need to be doing something different about service provision and how we provide services and how we staff it, and do we need a different kind of mix of services? There was this concern that how could any computer system really capture the nuances of people and what people are really like. So that was another thing that came up. And then, of course, the other thing, which I think Norm raised, which is that, in New York City, there's so many people coming in, there are limited resources, even though we are service rich. So, I feel like I should knock on wood. We do have a lot of services here. What does that mean for the people who don't score high, and are we focused as much on the people who might need other routes out as we are with the very high need people? What is the provider role in this? And I would say the first thing is to embrace this, right? It's coming, we're gonna love it, right? but to give it a fair chance, right? Not tolerate. So it's how we talk about diversity, right? You know, I don't want tolerance, right? I want celebration. So I know that we're a little far from that yet. We haven't gotten there yet. But this is what we want, because this is where we're going, and we are going to be doing this, folks. So we need to embrace it and really be able to try to look at it objectively. And that also means being honest about what works. You know, sometimes we can see what's not working. We focus on what's not working instead of what is working. So all I'm asking is that people give it a balanced try and look at what is working. But then also, when you're looking at what might not be working, there's a lot of providers in the room. And as we start to think about this is an iterative process. It's open to change. So when we start to see things that may be barriers or bottlenecks, be constructive, not to say, well, I had that vacancy. That apartment was vacant for, 2 months. Why would it have to be? So, okay, I hear you. 2 months is a long time. We certainly don't want to have any unit vacant for 2 months. Where did the system get blocked? Where are you having a problem? And what do you think should be done differently? Be constructive about how we're going to process this. So I think we all need to develop internal processes. We need to have some internal tracking. More evaluation, you say. Oh my God, is she saying I have to do more evaluation? But we need to look at like your data for the year before we use the system, maybe 2 years before the system, and then the data for the year that you started using the system. Are there differences? Are there more incidents? Are people coming faster, slower? Are they staying longer? Do you have a higher service need? So that we're not just, we tell a lot of narrative. Social workers, we love stories. We tell stories. We tell stories all the time, but stories, it's difficult to change a system based on a story. So data is really going to help us. And then I would say what's next. I mean, we've been focusing a lot on the assessment tool, starting almost finished with kind of the vulnerability index, right? So that if you have 7 people who have been homeless approximately the same time, SPIMI, you're seriously, persistently, mentally ill. What are the other, how are you going to prioritize one over the other? There are other vulnerability factors that we've been looking at a lot, and maybe some of you in this room were at the charrette, where we also had 80 people in the room trying to help look at vulnerability. So we're working on that. Obviously, what Craig said is we've been working on the actual system. The piece of the system that isn't finished yet is how do we put the housing into the system, right? So we have the types of housing in the system, but ultimately at some point, you're going to also get an address, you're going to get a provider, you're going to get an address, and you're going to get a contact name, right? So that's the goal for the system, so it's really matching people with the housing. And then I think, one of the things that came up as we were looking at the vulnerability index is kind of ongoing evaluation, so it is iterative, that it is working, that maybe we are looking at as we start to do this. Are we changing the entire system? Are there broader systems changes that have to be made? And I encourage anybody who wants to be a part of that process to let me know, jruffins@baileyhouse.org, because I really are looking for some people who maybe are not have been enmeshed in this for 2 years like I have been, to really be a part of the process as we start to roll it out. And that was it for me.
So thank you, all 3 of the panelists, for all your insight and information. We have about 15 minutes left for question and answer. So I won't spend too much time on my own questions. I'm sure you all have some burning questions in your mind. I did have one. We didn't have a chance to really talk too much about the vulnerability index, but that is a key piece to coordinated entry, right? How are we going to look at the folks that have the highest need and placing them first? So it was mentioned that there was a charrette recently. There was a group of about 80 or so people that came together and really tried to iron out, based on what HUD's guidelines were, how we decide how to measure people that have the highest service needs. One of the pieces that keeps coming up in conversation amongst the steering committee and others is, in New York City, we really like data, and we have a ton of it. There's so many different systems and ways that we can validate information on our clients' histories. But one of the pieces that HUD wants us to look at is, people with a category of folks that are like at risk of victimization is like one example, right? And so you can't necessarily validate that with data. And so there's going to be, at some point, perhaps pieces of a vulnerability index that might have to be based on self-report. And so I was curious if Norm could talk a little bit about if he's had experience with other communities that have grappled with this, perhaps, and ways in which they're able to balance, both self-report with data to look at folks with the highest service needs.
That's a great question. I will say most of the communities that I've seen that are using assessment tools do rely on a fair amount of self-reported data in their tools. I think there's a degree to which it's important to train people across the not just the coordinated access system, but across the entire community, not to be like, you hear these examples of, caseworkers coaching people, well, just don't pay attention to the question, just answer this, right? So you'll get a higher score and stuff. So there's an important training component here, but just because there's no way to verify something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And I think it is important and valuable. Where people have tried to validate tools, it's hard to validate coordinated entry tools, but where people have tried to validate them, it does appear that self-reported data does provide useful information when you sort of try to correlate the self-reported stuff with the stuff you can actually verify. It does appear that self-reported data can get you a higher need group. So I encourage people to use it. Certainly if you have, it's better to have a combination of data sources that you can sort of use together. But if you don't, I think self-reported data, particularly around things like victimization, is absolutely very useful.
Okay. All right, thank you. So let's open it up. I have, in case there are no questions, I have some others in mind, but I figured we could put it out to you all if you have some questions. Yes?
Yes, I'm a little disturbed because it sounds from the tenor of things that you really want people to get into housing and then maybe leave it later so there'll be more spaces for other people. That's what it sounds like, and because there's, quote, limited resources.
So I didn't want to imply that. So I do think that for some people, especially in supportive housing, it's permanent supportive housing. First of all, it's all permanent supportive housing, right? So you're not moving out because we're kind of telling you to move out. But I do think that there are people, survivors of domestic violence or young adults or people who are going through difficult periods of their time, a difficult period of time that may actually at this point in time score high on vulnerability. Right, so they seem like they're they're a match for supportive housing, partly because we don't have another model. So one of the things that I liked about what Norm says is maybe we have to come up with a different model, right? A titrated service model where we can remove the services. But right now, permanent supportive housing has supports for the rest of your life. And as somebody who is providing permanent supportive housing now for people who are living with HIV and AIDS, who could walk away from the support in that services. They've been stable for a very long period of time. What they need is probably the rental subsidy, but not the support services anymore. So I think there are always going to be people seriously, persistently, mentally. I mean, there's a number of populations that will always need support. But I do think there are people who either move into supportive housing because they need it at that time, that 4 or 5 years later do not need it, and because we don't have the fiscal resources or options to move them into the regular housing market, they stay in supportive housing, kind of tying up a very valuable resource. That's all I was saying.
That's a great point.
Back there?
Which, yeah, correct, probably I agree with you. At which point is a number assigned in terms of where you are on a waiting list for a particular provider? Do we not have the ability like we do now? Once the referrals are made, then you have an assigned number as to where you are on the list based on the provider to whom you refer. Is that how it works?
Can everybody hear the questions, by the way, or do you want me to repeat them? Would that be helpful? Yes? Okay. So the question is directed to Craig, and at what point is somebody assigned like a score and a place on a waiting list?
So we're very early in the process of developing the vulnerability index. I mean, we already have waiting lists. You know, we already have highly vulnerable people on waiting lists for supportive housing. You know, for the New York 3 Pop A group, there are over 1,400 people who are approved for that category right now. They're on a list. But what HUD is asking us to do is to, you know, of that group, we're basically taking that group and saying, what are the most vulnerable or the highest service need of that group, and or of other groups that we have. But yes, the vulnerability index, the vision for it is that we're going to have either some kind of score or some way to weight each individual so there will be an order to the list. You know, HUD, if you read any of the requirements, it's to be a by name list, and one of the things is that we have to agree as a locality on how we're going to order that list. We're early in the process, but I think we are going to go with some kind of probably some kind of numbering system.
Okay, question back there.
I have a question. You said that it's coming from a verified source. Can you detail as to where the source of the documents is coming from? Is that restricted to HRA?
Can you say that again?
Or you said the documents that in the beginning that are in the system, so they're coming from a verified source that's strictly through HRA? Or would there be other parties entering into the system?
So these are documents that the individual has provided to with their application for cash assistance, right? And so what we're doing is we're matching in that database, and for whatever document we have 90 doc types that we think would be helpful to you to place the person in supportive housing. So, some of those documents are going to be fine. Your Social Security card does not change, but your proof of income probably has a time limit on it. But yes, it's a verified data source because it's coming from, the HRA, and the person who has accepted the application and taken the documents has verified them.
Is it only HRA it's coming from, or are there other sources?
For the client document function, it's only coming from HRA at this point. Yeah.
Yes.
And also, to piggyback, so if another person submits the application, the PAC application, and currently what you see now, you wasn't the person that transmitted the application, you have to go with that agency to receive the application. Will the determination letter and the PAC, the determination letter and the summary be accessible on the site?
Yes. So one of the advantages to having the prior supportive housing application materials is that, say you get a match on a client who just entered your program, you went into the system. If that housing approval is still current, you can immediately start the process of referral based on the eligibility determination. You'll have the entire packet. Yep.
Okay, you want a question up here?
I'm curious if the database interfaces at all with HMIS, and if not, why did you decide not to go with HMIS, considering that there's a lot of questions questions in HMIS that would be to look at.
So let me repeat the question, because you're up front. I think it's harder to hear. The question is why, I think, tell me if I'm right, why did they choose to not use HMIS for this new system when there are some questions that need to be answered through that may overlap with the HRA system?
So what I gather is that HMIS has a lot of questions that, HUD wants to know, right? For our process of, applying every year for the NOFA, right? Because their performance as a locality. Now, a lot of those questions are not really relevant to like housing eligibility here in New York City. And so for us to use that system, certainly there may be a link with the HMIS system at some point, but in terms of like the functionality of the assessment, I'm not sure that HMIS questions would address everything that you would need in order to say like, okay, somebody is eligible for, say, a certain type of housing.
Also, one of the issues in New York City is that HMIS coverage, we're working to improve HMIS coverage and the number of people who are reporting through HMIS. It started with McKinney primarily, but as I said, initially, the percentage of McKinney-funded programs we don't have the coverage that we would need. And HRA was building out the program, so they started with theirs. We're still looking, because right now, they are trying to get programs who don't use their current program into the system. But I think if we had tried to reverse it by taking the number of people who do HMIS, we would have to reach a lot more people.
So currently in the PAC system, you can effect a referral in the system. That's not a function in the HMIS system. Do you know what I mean? So I can, I'm DHS, I'm a placement agency. I can, in the system, electronically refer to a provider in the system, send them, they get an email, they open it up, they get the application package. That is not a function in the HMIS system.
So they're not from New York City, so it's.
Okay. Maybe I'm not capturing what is anyone from?
Yeah, well, the New York City HMIS system, I think, is very small and not used by as many providers. It's not used by everybody. It's a very small
So I
percentage.
think maybe what you're asking is maybe in where are you from?
Syracuse, we have service points.
Oh.
It's widely used.
Okay, all right. So maybe Syracuse has, this very well-developed HMIS system, right? And so, but New York City doesn't. But we do have a very well-developed supportive housing application system. And so I think that there was a strategic decision to go with something that you could, have the most functionality in terms of that, of affecting referrals.
We just have 1 minute left. Is there one more question somebody might have? Yeah. No? Okay. Sure, yes.
So I had a question about HIPAA compliance and how do we ensure that when these documents, sometimes very sensitive information, is now being accessible by any agency, how do we ensure that we're not going against that? I know our agency right now is under that, mandate. How do we ensure that and overall confidentiality of our
So the consent is covered. We have HIPAA consent, and we also have consents for, it's like two parts to the consent. There's a HIPAA portion to it, and there's also a portion that covers all the health information. And so that agreement is between the client and the agency. But on the consent, it also gives permission for and this is part of, informed consent with the client. It also gives permissions to certain government agencies in order to, share the information. Because how many people do you have to share the information to affect a referral, right? And so if the client consents to that and they understand that the information is going to be available to the agency that they sign the consent with, and then can be shared with other agencies, then I don't think that there is a problem with the consent.
I guess my understanding has always been that there's always a HIPAA compliance consent form always has to be very specific from this entity to that exact entity. And I've never understood it to be in this sort of entire catchment entity. So I guess that's why I'm a little concerned. That it's not just a direct one-on-one consent form, it's really opening it up to the entire system as a whole. That's really what I'm
So I would encourage you to take a look at the consent form. You can reach out to me if you have concerns about it.
My question was just, well, not exactly first, but just to go to the overall safety of the system, with all the information we have now about hacking and so forth and concern. Just be, I know you're correct, just be close to that.
The question is, can Craig speak to the overall safety of the system?
I've been assured it's very safe. I'm not a technical person, as you can tell.
There are requirements.
It's
from
firewall,
HUD.
it's all very protected. Our systems are very protected. You realize that there's all sorts of security features that, City MIS has instituted in all of our systems. So, and sometimes that's obviously that's a good thing for protecting the information, but it also is like, you have all these layers that you have to kind of get through to get to our systems.
Yeah.
Pros and cons.
Okay. Well, thanks again, everyone.